I never thought lying would turn into such a big deal. I mean, it's not like I cheated with someone better looking, it just happened. Everyone acts like I committed murder when all I did was have a moment of weakness during a particularly boring period of my marriage. Tom and I had been together for 5 years, married for 3, and honestly things had gotten predictable and routine in ways that made me feel invisible. The moment Tom held our newborn daughter for the first time, his face went from pure joy to confusion to something I'd never seen before, complete devastation. He looked at her dark hair, her distinctive features, then at me, then back at the baby. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, "Nice try, Sienna, but this isn't my child." He placed her back in my arms, walked out of the hospital room, and I haven't seen him since. But let's go back to how this all began. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. Now let's get back to the story. I'm Sienna, 28, and I've never been the type of person who does things halfway. When I commit to something, I give it everything I have. That's how I approached my marriage to Tom, my job at the marketing firm, and even this whole pregnancy situation that everyone seems to think makes me some kind of monster. But nobody wants to hear about the context or the circumstances that led to my choices. They just want to judge and point fingers like they've never made mistakes. Tom worked in logistics for a mid-sized shipping company. He made a decent living, nothing flashy, and followed the same routine every single day. He'd come home at the exact same time, eat dinner with the news on, and be in bed by 10:30. Dependable, yes. But after 3 years of marriage, the relationship had lost its spark. It started to feel like I was just living with someone who occasionally remembered to kiss me goodnight. That's when Jason joined our marketing department. He was 26, a personal trainer on weekends, and had this confident, magnetic presence. He actually listened when I spoke. Not just nodding, but really hearing me. He made me feel seen and interesting again, like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years. Compared to the predictability at home, his energy was refreshing, maybe even irresistible. Our connection started with harmless lunches, mostly about work. We'd talk about campaign strategies and client pitches. He complimented my ideas, said I was undervalued and should be running my own agency. Our talks gradually stretched into longer breaks and eventually turned into drinks after work. Somewhere along the way, those moments stopped being just professional. I never planned for anything to happen. But one evening, we stayed late working on a big presentation. Everyone else had left. We were relaxed, celebrating a win with a bit of wine. The office was quiet, the lights low. At some point, we kissed. It was impulsive, unplanned. And once that line was crossed, we didn't stop. The guilt lasted about 24 hours before I convinced myself it was just physical attraction and stress relief. Tom and I barely touched each other anymore, so it wasn't like I was cheating him out of some passionate romance. If anything, sleeping with Jason made me a better wife because I came home relaxed and satisfied instead of frustrated and resentful. Our arrangement continued for about 3 months. Quick encounters during lunch breaks, stolen moments when we stayed late to finish projects. One weekend when Tom went to visit his parents and Jason came over to my house. It was exciting and spontaneous and everything my marriage wasn't. I felt like myself again instead of this domesticated version who organized meal prep and remembered to pay bills. I was careful about birth control, but apparently not careful enough. When I missed my period and the pregnancy test came back positive, I went into full panic mode. Tom and I had been trying to get pregnant for over a year with no success, so the timing couldn't have been worse. Or better, depending on how you looked at it. The timeline was close enough that I could convince myself the baby was Tom's. We'd had sex a few times during the right window, even if it had been the obligatory trying to conceive kind, rather than anything passionate. I decided the pregnancy was a sign that I needed to end things with Jason and focus on my marriage and my future family. I told Jason the same day I told Tom about the pregnancy. Jason looked relieved when I said it definitely wasn't his, that the timing didn't work out right and he didn't need to worry about anything. Tom cried happy tears and immediately started talking about converting the spare room into a nursery and how he'd always wanted to be a father. Watching Tom's joy over the pregnancy made me feel sick with guilt for about a week, but then I convinced myself that biology didn't determine who would be a good father and Tom would love this baby regardless of genetics. The baby would be better off with Tom as a father anyway. Jason had made it clear he wasn't interested in anything serious or long-term. Tom threw himself into pregnancy preparation with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. He read parenting books, researched the best cribs and car seats, attended every doctor's appointment with detailed questions for the obstetrician. He painted the nursery a cheerful yellow since we'd decided to wait until birth to learn the baby's sex. The guilt came in waves during the pregnancy, usually when Tom would talk excitedly about family genetics and wonder whether the baby would have his eyes or my nose. He'd put his hand on my belly and talk about teaching our child to ride bikes and play catch, planning family vacations and college funds. I'd remind myself that those plans could still happen regardless of paternity. Jason and I maintained professional distance after I told him about the pregnancy. He seemed relieved that I wasn't making claims or demands on him, and I was grateful he wasn't making the situation more complicated than it already was. We worked on different projects and barely spoke beyond basic office interactions. About halfway through the pregnancy, Jason started dating someone from the accounting department. Watching them flirt in the break room and hold hands at company happy hours made me realize how superficial our connection had really been. He'd moved on completely while I was dealing with the consequences of our affair alone. Tom's excitement only grew as my due date approached. He took vacation time for the last month of pregnancy so he could help with household tasks and be available when labor started. He packed and repacked the hospital bag, timed my contractions with multiple apps on his phone, and called his parents to tell them their first grandchild was about to arrive. The night before I went into labor, Tom surprised me with the finished nursery. He'd spent weeks working on details I hadn't even noticed. Handmade mobile with painted wooden animals, custom shelving for books and toys, a reading chair positioned perfectly for middle-of-the-night feedings. He was so proud of what he'd created for our family. That's when Jason texted asking how I was feeling and whether the baby had arrived yet. I'd been ignoring his occasional check-ins throughout the pregnancy, but seeing his name on my phone while Tom showed me the nursery made me realize how precarious my situation really was. I deleted the message and blocked his number, hoping to eliminate any connection before the birth. Labor started the next morning with contractions that quickly became intense and frequent. Tom drove me to the hospital with steady hands and a calm voice, even though I could tell he was nervous and excited. He held my hand through contractions and reminded me to breathe, telling me how proud he was and how perfect our family was going to be. The delivery room was everything I'd imagined. Bright lights, encouraging nurses, Tom standing beside me coaching me through pushes. When the baby finally arrived after 12 hours of labor, the relief was overwhelming. Tom cut the cord with tears streaming down his face, and the nurses placed our daughter on my chest for skin-to-skin contact. She was beautiful in that wrinkled, slightly alien way that all newborns are. Dark hair, bright eyes, tiny, perfect fingers and toes. Tom kept saying she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen and that he couldn't believe she was ours. The nurses cleaned her up and handed her to Tom while they delivered the placenta and stitched me up. That's when I noticed the first strange look. The nurse glanced between Tom and the baby with a slightly confused expression before quickly looking away. Tom was so focused on holding his daughter that he didn't notice, but I caught the exchange and felt my stomach drop. When the pediatrician came to do the initial examination, she made polite comments about the baby's health and reflexes, but when Tom mentioned something about the baby having his grandmother's nose, the doctor just smiled non-committally and continued her notes. I told myself I was being paranoid, that newborns changed dramatically in their first few weeks. The next few hours were a blur of visitors and congratulations. Tom's parents arrived first, followed by my mum and several close friends. Everyone commented on how beautiful the baby was, but I noticed some awkward pauses when people tried to identify family resemblances. Tom was too euphoric to pick up on the subtle discomfort in the room. By evening, most visitors had gone home, and it was just Tom, me, and the baby in the quiet hospital room. Tom held her while she slept, stroking her dark hair and whispering about all the adventures they'd have together. I watched him fall completely in love with this child he believed was his, and the guilt felt like a physical weight on my chest. That night, after Tom went home to shower and get some rest before staying overnight the next day, I really looked at the baby for the first time. Her features were becoming more defined as the initial swelling went down, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She looked exactly like Jason. The same dark hair, the same eye shape, even the same nose and chin structure. I told myself it was too early to tell, that babies change dramatically in their first months, that genetics can be unpredictable. But deep down I knew what Tom would eventually realize. The question was how long I had before he figured it out, and whether I could somehow prepare him for the truth. Tom returned the next morning with flowers and coffee, ready to spend the day learning to change diapers and swaddle. He was so natural with the baby, so gentle and attentive. Watching him hold her and sing softly while she slept, I almost convinced myself that biology didn't matter as much as love and commitment. But throughout the day, I caught more looks from hospital staff. Nurses would glance between Tom and the baby with barely concealed confusion. The pediatrician asked twice about family medical history, as if she was trying to reconcile something that didn't make sense. By afternoon, the atmosphere in the room felt strained. Tom didn't seem to notice anything unusual until late afternoon when he was holding the baby near the window for better light. He'd been pointing out her tiny features and talking about family traits when he suddenly went very quiet. I watched his expression change from joy to confusion to something approaching horror. He looked at the baby, then at me, then back at the baby. His voice when he finally spoke was flat and controlled in a way I'd never heard before. He said we needed to talk, but not here, not now. He handed the baby to me without making eye contact and said he needed some air. Tom left the room and didn't come back for 3 hours. I spent that time in increasing panic, trying to call him and getting no answer. When he finally returned, he looked like a different person. Older, tired, distant. He asked me directly if there was anything I needed to tell him about the pregnancy or the baby. I tried to play innocent, asking what he meant and whether he was feeling overwhelmed by new fatherhood. But Tom wasn't buying my confusion. He said he'd spent the afternoon thinking about timing and genetics and conversations we'd had about trying to get pregnant. He said some things weren't adding up. That's when he pulled out a small envelope from his jacket pocket. He'd apparently stopped by a pharmacy and gotten an over-the-counter paternity test kit. He said he'd been suspicious for weeks but hoped he was wrong, that seeing the baby had confirmed his worst fears. He said he'd paid for everything, the pregnancy, the hospital, the nursery, and this was what I'd given him in return. Tom left the envelope on my bedside table and walked out without another word. I sat there holding our daughter and staring at the paternity test kit, knowing that everything I'd built was about to crumble. The baby started crying, and for the first time since her birth, I had no idea how to comfort her. The drive home from the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Tom had left while I was still in recovery, so I had to arrange my own transportation. My mum picked me up but didn't say much during the ride, just made polite comments about the baby and asked if I needed anything from the store. The house felt different when I walked in with the baby. Tom's presence was completely gone. His clothes, his books, his coffee mug from the kitchen counter. The nursery he'd worked so hard on was exactly as he'd left it, but now it felt like a museum exhibit rather than a baby's room. My mum helped me get settled and made dinner, but I could tell she was waiting for an explanation about why Tom wasn't there. When she finally asked directly where my husband was, I told her we'd had a disagreement and he needed some space. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push for details either. Over the next few days, I tried calling and texting Tom with no response. His phone went straight to voicemail and my messages showed as delivered but not read. I even drove by his office, but his co-workers said he'd taken extended leave and they weren't sure when he'd be back. I attempted to reach Jason to tell him about the situation, but discovered he'd blocked me on all social media and changed his phone number. When I asked around the office, I learned he'd put in his notice and moved to another city for a new job. He'd apparently seen the writing on the wall and decided to disappear before any complications arose. The isolation became overwhelming as word of the situation spread through our social circle. Friends who'd sent congratulations and offered to bring meals suddenly became unavailable when I called. The group chat I'd been part of for years went quiet whenever I posted, and eventually I realized I'd been removed from it entirely. Social media became a minefield of posts celebrating Tom and offering him support during what people euphemistically called his difficult time. Several mutual friends posted about what a good man he was and how he deserved better. Nobody mentioned me or the baby, like we'd been erased from the narrative entirely. My own family's support began to waver as details emerged. My mum started asking pointed questions about the timeline of the pregnancy and whether I'd been completely honest with Tom. When I continued to insist that everything was complicated and not what it seemed, she said she needed to think about what kind of help she could provide. 2 weeks after coming home from the hospital, I received divorce papers via certified mail. Tom was seeking full custody of our house, half of our savings, and wanted no parental rights or responsibilities for the baby. The papers referenced paternity fraud and intentional misrepresentation as grounds for the divorce. I tried calling the lawyer who'd handled our house purchase to ask about my options, but he said he couldn't represent me due to conflict of interest. Every attorney I contacted wanted a significant retainer that I couldn't afford, especially since Tom had frozen our joint accounts pending the divorce proceedings. The reality of my situation began to sink in as bills arrived that I couldn't pay alone. The mortgage, utilities, car payment, and credit cards that had been manageable on 2 incomes became impossible on my maternity leave salary. Without Tom's income or family support, I was looking at bankruptcy and possibly losing the house. I spent hours every day trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. 6 months ago, I'd been a married woman with a stable life, planning for a baby with a husband who loved me. Now I was alone with a newborn, facing divorce and financial ruin, cut off from everyone I'd counted on for support. The hardest part was looking at my daughter and trying to feel the maternal love that was supposed to be automatic. She was beautiful and innocent, but every time I held her, I was reminded of the lies I'd told and the life I'd destroyed. She deserved better than to be the product of deception and the symbol of her mother's selfishness. Late at night when she cried and I was the only one there to comfort her, I'd think about Tom and how naturally he'd taken to fatherhood. He would have been an amazing dad, patient and loving and present in ways Jason never could be. I'd robbed my daughter of that father figure because I was too selfish and cowardly to deal with the consequences of my affair. I started doubting every choice I'd made over the past year. Had I really been that unhappy in my marriage? Or had I just been bored and looking for excitement? Was Tom really as predictable as I'd convinced myself? Or had I stopped appreciating his stability and reliability? Had I thrown away a good life for a few months of meaningless sex? The questions kept me awake at night, feeding the baby in the perfect nursery Tom had created for a child he'd thought was his. I'd sit in the chair he'd positioned for optimal comfort during night feedings, surrounded by the toys and books he'd carefully selected, using the bottles he'd researched and purchased. 3 months after the birth, I received the final divorce decree in the mail. Tom had been granted everything he'd asked for, and I was officially alone. No alimony, no child support, no contact information for future communication. He'd managed to completely sever our legal and financial connection as if our marriage had never existed. I tried to restart my life, looking for apartments I could afford and figuring out childcare so I could return to work. But my reputation had followed me everywhere, and job interviews became uncomfortable when potential employers recognized my name from local gossip. Single motherhood in a small professional community came with challenges I hadn't anticipated. The baby started sleeping better around 4 months, which gave me more time to think about my situation and less excuse to avoid facing reality. I'd convinced myself that I was the victim of circumstances and bad timing, but sitting alone in the house Tom had worked to provide, I couldn't escape the truth of what I'd done. I had lied to the 2 most important people in my life and manipulated them both for my own convenience. Tom had trusted me completely, and I'd used that trust to cover up an affair that produced a child he'd believed was his. Jason had trusted my assurance that the baby wasn't his concern, and I'd let him disappear rather than take responsibility for our actions. The worst part was realizing that I'd destroyed any chance of my daughter having a stable, loving family. Tom would have been a devoted father despite genetics, but I'd made that impossible by lying from the beginning. Jason might have stepped up if I'd been honest, but I'd eliminated that possibility by letting him leave without knowing the truth. Now my daughter would grow up with a single mother who'd proven herself capable of devastating deception, in a community where everyone knew the story of her conception. She'd never have the benefit of a father figure or the stability of a 2-parent household because I'd prioritized momentary pleasure over long-term consequences. Standing in the nursery late one night, holding the pacifier Tom had carefully selected from dozens of options, I finally understood what I'd lost. Not just a husband or a marriage, but the chance to be the person I'd thought I was. The woman who'd valued honesty and commitment, who'd believed in building something lasting with someone who loved her. I'd traded all of that for a few months of excitement that meant nothing to anyone involved. Jason had moved on without a second thought. Tom had cut me out of his life completely, and I was left alone with a baby who deserved so much better than the circumstances I'd created for her. I lied once about something that affected everyone involved, and now no one believes anything I say, not even me, even